Good morning, afternoon, or evening, colleagues, depending on where you are. A very warm welcome to this session, The World After COP26, organized by UNDP. Thank you for joining us today, either via Zoom or YouTube. This is Martin Cadena, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. Before discovering the agenda together, just a couple of housekeeping items. One, please enter your questions in advance using the Q&A box, mentioning if it is directed to a specific panelist. Our speakers will be happy to respond to you via text or live during the Q&A part of the session. You will find the presentation and the recording of the session later today in our Sparklu site. I will enter the link in a minute. For our YouTube audience, we will add the link into the description after the session. And now let's move on. If we can have the next slide, please. We have a super interesting and packed agenda today. As you can see, this can easily be a course syllabus about COP26. We have 3 blocks of presentations. The first is about the major outcomes and announcements, UNFCCC reflections on the way forward, and youth and indigenous peoples representatives reflection. The second block is about negotiation outcomes. This is not a comprehensive list of negotiations at COP26, just the ones that UNDP followed quite closely. And in the third block, we will discuss some examples of UNDP support, the climate promise, the sustainable energy hub, and we will also talk about advocacy and a call to action. Then we will have time for interacting with all of you through the Q&A. So let's get started. If we can go to the next slide. We have a dream line of speakers today. I will quickly introduce the first block presenters, and in the interest of time, I will expand a bit just on our guest speakers. So we have with us Cassie Flynn, Strategic Advisor on Climate Change and Head of the Climate Promise at UNDP. After Cassie, we will have Sergei Kononov, who is a manager in the Transparency Division of the UNFCCC Secretariat. He has been with the United Nations since 1998, including about 20 years of service to the Secretariat. Mr. Kononov has been managing multiple key activities of the Secretariat, in particular, those relating to international negotiations. At present, he's in charge of coordinating the work of the UNFCCC Secretariat relating to nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. After Sergei, we will have Elizabeth Gulugulu, who is a Master Science candidate in biodiversity conservation and highly experienced in youth mobilization for climate-smart agriculture activism and research in sustainable agricultural solutions. She is the contact point for the NDCs and Agriculture Working Group under the official Children and Youth constituency to the UNFCCC, and she has been leading youth consultations in the NDC enhancement process in her country. And closing block number 1, we will have Andrea Carmen, who is Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council, an organization of indigenous people from North, Central, and South America and the Pacific, working for the sovereignty and self-determination of indigenous people. She was selected by consensus to be the Indigenous Peoples Co-Chair for the Facilitative Working Group for the UNFCCC Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform for the current term. And now, with no further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, Cassie Flynn. So Cassie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today. A very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you around the world who are tuning in for this webinar. One thing that I think is so important about all of this is that we are really facing a curve in the road when it comes to climate action. And certainly we saw this play out in Glasgow at COP26. And so what I'm going to do is talk about some of these big picture things that came out of COP26, these big picture outcomes, both within the negotiating room, but also just as importantly, what was happening outside of the negotiating room. And one of the things that really strikes me as I was looking at even just the agenda that Martin was sharing was how many different pieces there are to this. And as you can see, we have a lot of wonderful speakers today describing the various elements of this, because climate change touches every single part of our lives, every single part of society. And there's a lot of elements that we need to cover, and how they fit together really is a reflection of the outcomes of Glasgow and some of the challenges that we have as we're focusing now on the road toward COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So first, I really want to focus on some of these big picture issues that came out when it comes to the negotiations of Glasgow. And the big headline that a lot of people saw coming out of this was something called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And this was really important. This was the big sort of overarching decision that came out of COP, and it had some very important elements to it. It really recognized the strong importance of multilateralism in science. We know that climate is a global issue. It has to be tackled with global solutions. It referenced fossil fuels for the very first time. And although originally it started talking about phasing out fossil fuels and then got weakened down to phase down, there's still very promising signals there that we do have fossil fuels now as a part of these negotiations and a part of this picture when it comes to the outcomes of COP. And then these very important nationally determined contributions. These nationally determined contributions are the heart of the Paris Agreement. These are the pledges that countries bring forward, ideally every 5 years, that increase their climate ambition. And this year in Glasgow, parties were meant to show up to Glasgow with these pledges. And the signals are very strong. The Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism is working, but we know that we need to do more. And this Glasgow Climate Pact really referenced the fact that there's an opportunity for parties to be able to resubmit these pledges in a more ambitious way. And then there were a number of really important technical outcomes, and the biggest was the finalization of the Paris Agreement Rulebook. This has been negotiated really since the moment that Paris was adopted. And the negotiators had been through years of tackling very complicated issues as a part of these negotiations. And now in Glasgow, they reached agreement on some of the final, stickiest, most complicated issues that were there. And we're going to hear a little bit about this on Article 6 on carbon markets, on transparency, on common timeframes of NDCs. These issues were really the final ones as a part of this Paris Agreement Rulebook that has now been wrapped up. And we now have, this means, the rules of the road for how countries are going to abide by the Paris Agreement. It's critically important. We saw very important steps on adaptation, in terms of finance, in terms of the global goal, and of course, with the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. These were very important steps forward. And unfortunately, we also saw some holding back. We saw slow or no progress on some of the big issues that many parties had hoped were going to take big leaps. In many ways, Glasgow took steps we needed, but it didn't take the leaps that we needed, in particular on finance and loss and damage. These two issues were critically important going into Glasgow, and they will be critically important to make progress on as we move forward toward COP27. Now, on the screen, you can see a whole host of major announcements that were made at COP26. Now, these weren't in the negotiating room, but these were alongside and added a whole set of momentum and a set of dialogues and pledges and actions and coalitions that really could sort of help support action on climate change around the world. And I'm not going to go into all of these, and this really just scratches the surface, but some of the big ticket ones that we saw come out were certainly this China-US declaration, this idea that China and the US are going to continue to work together to strengthen implementation of the Paris Agreement. Being the two largest emitters in the world, this is really critically important for the success of the Paris Agreement and for the success of climate action. We saw huge pledges on adaptation. We saw the leaders' declaration on forests and land use. We saw commitments on fossil fuels. We saw commitments toward countries like South Africa. And these major announcements really added a set of momentum and a set of importance to really all of these different things that are going on. And we're going to see them really play out on the road ahead. Next slide. So what does all of this mean? And when you look at the headlines out of COP26, you see a real variety of interpretations. Some say, hey, this is the best that we could get at this time. These are important steps forward. You see others saying, hey, this really fell short. This fell short of what it needed to do. And what's important here is that COP26 is a really important milestone in the climate negotiations, but it is on this very long road that we have toward increasing our ambition on climate action. And something that I really take out of the discussions in Glasgow is that while we didn't get everything we wanted, certainly, as I mentioned, finance, loss and damage, some of these big issues really fell short, we are seeing really strong underlying signals. And this is critically important. In Glasgow, over 120 heads of state showed up. At a time when the world is facing a global pandemic, this really demonstrated high political commitment by leaders around the world, really emphasizing that climate change is a global problem and that needs to be solved really among the highest levels of government around the world. And then, of course, we saw business leaders, civil society leaders, we saw activists, we saw young people, we saw older people, we saw people advocating for various types of communities that are really vulnerable to the climate crisis. COP26 was a place where everyone showed up, and this is really important. I've been going to these COPs for a long time, and I still remember the days when you could barely sometimes get a headline out of these COPs. And this is critically important that we're seeing these COPs as a place where there's huge momentum and huge buy-in from various communities, leaders around the world. The second strong underlying signal is about NDCs. These nationally determined contributions. Glasgow was the place where everybody had to show up with these pledges. And this is important because the first generation of pledges were submitted right around the Paris Agreement adoption. And then now, 5 years later, this second generation, countries really needed to step up. And we saw 154 NDCs submitted. This is really important. This is a majority of countries. These are countries that did show up to Glasgow. The Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism is working. In many ways, we've seen it in real time. When you added up all the NDCs, for the first generation, you saw the global temperature sort of estimate be around 3.5, 3.7 degrees. With this second generation set of NDCs, that has been reduced by as much as a full degree at 2.5, 2.7 degrees. This is critically important. In 5 years, we have been able to mobilize against that target. We know we have a lot more to do. We need to get to 1.5. We are nowhere close to that. This doesn't mean that we stop. This doesn't mean that we say that we've achieved what we need to achieve, but there's progress there. There's signals there. And if we keep the pressure on, we can get these third generation NDCs where we need to get them. UNDP played a critical role in a lot of these NDCs, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar, but we supported 80% of developing countries. And something that was critically important out of this, and we saw this through our recent report on the state of ambition on climate change, that SIDS and LDCs, these small island developing states, least developed countries, are leading the way on ambition. They're some of the most vulnerable in the world. They're some of the smallest emitters in the world, but they are showing leadership. They are showing the way forward. And a lot of these higher emitters, a lot of these middle income countries, other countries have a lot to learn from the SIDS and LDCs. And this is really, really important. We saw high private sector and civil society engagement. This is critically important, as I mentioned before. Also, the G20. The G20 is discussing climate change in a way that we have not seen previously. This certainly affected COP26. And then also we had the largest media presence in UNFCCC history. The plenary was broadcast. The plenary was shown around the world. This is very, very important and demonstrates again that we have a lot of momentum and we must keep it. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sergey, who is from UNFCCC. Sergey, it's been such a pleasure collaborating with you over the years, and now to you to talk about what's next. Thanks.
Thank you, Cassie. That's a pleasure at this side as well. To complement a bit what you've just said, I would like to look at Glasgow in somewhat different perspective. We need to remember, first of all, what the goals of the Paris Agreement are, and they're quite ambitious. I will not read them through, but they relate to mitigation, adaptation, and finance. Before Glasgow, there was kind of accumulating feeling that we need to do a lot and urgently, because the action, as we know it, was not sufficient. And this feeling of urgency was underpinned by, first of all, by science, the IPCC report, the WMO reports, but also a number of other reports like our disease synthesis report, the UNEP GAP report. All these documents were signaling that we are far from where we should be, and we are not on a path leading us to the objectives of the Paris Agreement as we know them. On top of this, there was also sense of that sense of urgency was also underpinned by the known delay in the whole UNFCCC process in the international negotiations on climate change, because of the known reason. The pandemic basically put on hold many of our activities. And although we tried to do what we could with virtual meetings, still it was not the same. So with all that, it is important to understand that parties came to Glasgow ready to work. And this readiness to work was seen quite distinctly throughout all the negotiations. And the motto put forward by the presidency, to keep 1.5 alive, this was a good motto, and it was driving actually the negotiations, especially as the COP presidency was very committed and very engaged in the preparations and the conduct of the conference. So we will see later today quite an overview of the key negotiation areas. And we already saw an overview of some action by non-party stakeholders beyond the negotiations room. So all in all, maybe we can go to the next slide. If you look at the outcomes, and we will look at them in detail later today, they cover the whole spectrum of what is needed, and they relate to those key objectives of the Paris Agreement, which you see again on screen. We have significant outcomes on mitigation, including a call to strengthen 2030 targets in the NDCs, and a work program which lacks detail, but still a work program was established on mitigation. We have very good outcomes on adaptation, on loss and damage, although, as Casey said, more ideally would have been expected, but still we have recognition of the importance of this area. We have something on the Santiago network and an established dialogue on funding. We still have an outcome on finance, which brings the process forward. Again, we didn't get confirmation of the 100 billion goal, but steps to address this issue have been taken. Work continues, and we have a clear process going forward on the new collective goal on finance. So with all this, I believe we can say that this was a truly successful UN conference, and we see that the international climate change regime, the policy level mechanism, it has been acting on science. This was quite clear, quite visible in Glasgow, and this is very good. And I can by join Casey in that statement that this conference confirmed that multilateralism within the UN context is the right approach to global issues, and we see and saw in Glasgow that it delivers. Thank you. And with this, I now pass the floor over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for the platform. I'll be giving a feedback on the outcomes representing young people, as I was also a participant, a youth participant. So when it comes to the Conference of the Parties, as a group of young people, what we normally do is we have what we call the Conference of Youth, which is whereby young people, they capacitate each other on what the negotiations are, how they can submit their interventions within the UNFCCC systems. Actually, the UNGO is the official children and youth constituency to the UNFCCC. And I was there as a participant representing the Indigenous working group. So basically, like I said, the Conference of Youth, this is where young people, they meet, they capacitate each other, because we always have a new group of young people coming in to attend the Conference of the Parties, but to make sure that they are not so much confused, because a lot of things are happening at the same time. We have our days before the main Conference of the Parties, where we share information, how the conferences of the parties work, how they can participate, how they can engage with decision makers. And this is a platform with more than 5,000 young people. It is a very big platform, and this year it was quite easy because we were also able to actually engage even the other young people that were not on the ground. So they would actually join in virtually and would constantly update each other on what is happening on the ground. Next slide. So as you can see, we also have the UNFCCC that normally come within for the Conference of Youth, and they also have, normally most of the times, they take a session on communication, how to communicate climate science. We also have other representatives from other organizations, to name just but a few. This time around, we actually had even the embassies, the UK aid, the US aid, who came to the Conference of the Parties to engage and have a conversation with young people on their expectations for COP. Next slide. After COP, there is a document that is normally produced, which is the position paper for young people. As you can see, this is the Global Youth Statement. The Global Youth Statement includes all topics that are negotiated within the Conference of the Parties. You're talking about loss and damage, adaptation, and disease, Coroniva Joint Work on Agriculture, and it is submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat. This time around, we were called by the EU, and we were handing over this Global Youth Statement to the EU Vice President Timmermans. With this Global Youth Statement was also handed over to even the UNFCCC Secretariat. Not only that, but also the UK President. Next slide. Amongst ourselves as young people, we also have the junior negotiators, and some of the young people, they represent their party delegates, and they follow different thematic negotiated topics within the UNFCCC. As you can see, these are pictures of some of our youth representatives following different types of negotiations. And they are also free to, to share this information to the other guys that really do not understand what negotiations are. And it makes even our interventions even stronger, because these guys, they understand the technical part of what will be happening within the UNFCCC. Next slide. So when it comes to young people, engagement of young people within the UNFCCC circles, we normally refer to ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment, which highlights the critical role of young people within the UNFCCC. And this year, I think this was a big plus for us, young people, because ACE, in as much as it came up with its 10-year Glasgow work program, but it also highlighted the important role of young people as agents of change. So this was a big success for us as young people, because ACE really highlights how even governments should engage young people as part of their party delegation, how governments should engage young people to be their focal points for the ACE. So this was quite a huge success for us, and we pushed for this. Also, young people, they were given an advisory board seat by the city CN, which was also a big plus. And we also have a bunch of young people that have been following the NDCs and the enhanced transparency frameworks, who are also part of the technical aspects of their respective countries. So this is just to show how young people are not only participating in conferences of the parties as numbers, but they are participating in the conferences of the parties as stakeholders. They are participating there as technical experts. They are participating there as people that are actually giving valid information, valid interventions on the table. Next slide. Besides the negotiations, we also have other events that we participate in, side events that will be taking place by the private sector, by the NGO sector. And this is where young people, they engage some, they actually get funding, which can help them to upskill their various projects in their respective countries. Next slide. Just to conclude this presentation, some of the challenges that young people really face, whether before COP or at COP, is that most of the young people, in as much as funding is really an issue to participate at COP, but even the institutional capacity of young people, it also needs to be strengthened. In order for a young person to be technically capacitated, their institutional capacity should be strong. So these are some of the challenges that are there. Even the framework of the policies, they should engage young people from the beginning. This makes it easy for young people to engage more and to understand more on policy-related issues. And then there's also need for access to climate finance. I'm sure this was overly emphasized at COPs. Climate finance, it should be youth-friendly, and it should make it easy for young people to access these resources. There's need for program exchanges. Most of us, we normally meet at COP, but it's not enough. At COP, we share ideas, but after that, there is need for young people to always be capacitated, make sure that these program exchanges, they help to strengthen the youth movement. They understand the technicality part of it. They even understand how to write good proposals, because these proposals, they are the ones that we use when you go to COP in terms, if we want to access financial resources. And above all, there is need for meaningful youth engagement. There's been a lot of talk on youth tokenism, but if you're talking about youth engagement, we're saying that young people should be engaged from the first step of each and every project. Attending meetings is really not enough, but young people should be given a platform to air out their views, to also give decisions when it comes to the most important things that affect us. Thank you so much. This marks the end of the presentation, and I will hand it over to Andrea.
Liosem Chaniabo, and thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to highlight some of the advances, shortfalls, and next steps for defending the rights and survival of Indigenous peoples after COP26. Speaking from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, I want to show this beginning slide just to highlight the relationship that Indigenous peoples have, which is better defined as our ways of knowing that we can bring to the table as examples, but also which ensure our own survival. This is a traditional corn altar from a ceremony in Oaxaca, Mexico, and it shows the 4 sacred colors of corn, representing the 4 directions, but also representing our capacity for adaptation to climate change based on our knowledge of the weather to come and the kind of season we'll be having, and therefore the kind of corn that we need to plant, the color of corn, in order to ensure that we will have our food sovereignty in the time of climate change. And this knowledge is becoming even more important as we move ahead. Next slide, please. This is just an example from my homeland. Last year was the hottest, driest year ever recorded in southern Arizona. We have a family farm. On the right is my husband, who's a traditional knowledge holder, showing one of our young tribal members how to protect the plants. But on the left is that same kind of cactus last year, and it's a natural indigenous food and medicinal plant, the nopal, and it was wilting, even being natural to the desert. Next slide, please. Of course, our primary commitment was always to ensure our survival, that the IPCC and other scientific studies have shown that Indigenous peoples' ways of life and even our lands and territories are at stake for survival. Even the study that came out in August of 2021 predicted that there was a much more need for a commitment and increase by the states to keep the temperature, and the Indigenous peoples were maybe the front lines of risk for our survival and way of life. And also that some of the changes are already irreversible, like the melting of the Greenland ice sheets, which affects all of us, but in particular Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. Next slide. As was mentioned before, we share the disappointment of our colleagues from Samal Island developing states and many other constituencies regarding the weakening of the language to phasing down instead of phasing out of coal. But the positive side, as was mentioned, was this was the first time in a COP outcome document where fossil fuels were even mentioned. They were always the elephant in the room, as they say, and this is progress, but not enough. Next slide. Of course, our rights-based approach is very key. Without recognition of our rights, we have no chance to survive climate change as Indigenous peoples. And this was very hard-fought language with other colleagues defending rights of various constituencies, that the preamble of the Paris Agreement recognized the rights of Indigenous peoples as well as human rights in general. Next slide. This was a major fight for us relating to Article 6, is that the concerns about carbon offsets, forest offsets. The question is, what is being offset, and how does that affect Indigenous peoples in another region? There's a lot of concern about the mega projects like dams that are being promoted by Article 6 type activities. So it was this is a demonstration of Indigenous youth at COP25 in Madrid, talking about false solutions and concerns. So a big concern for us was ensuring that there be rights safeguards in Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook. And I'm happy to say that we achieved most of our goals in that. Rights language was brought from what had been the preamble in the Paris Agreement into the operative text, which was a big step forward, both in the chapeau, and many of the provisions of Article 6 did contain rights safeguards, as well as a redress process, and not strong enough, but at least some language about safeguards and consultation going forward. Also relating to the body that I'm on, of course, operative paragraph 135 of the Paris decision recognized the importance of Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, and that's the basis for the creation of the LSIP. Next slide. Of course, when we talk about rights of Indigenous peoples, we always reflect on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the internationally recognized minimum standard, and we utilize Article 31 in the work of the LSIP, our Indigenous peoples' rights to maintain, control, develop our cultural heritage, including seeds and knowledge of flora and fauna. Very essential. Next slide, please. This was the creation of the facilitative working group at COP24 in order to operationalize the platform. These are states and Indigenous peoples coming together to celebrate. Next slide. We achieved many of our core objectives for Indigenous peoples, including equal direct participation. Indigenous peoples choose our own members on the LSIP. It respects in its entirety the UN Declaration, and also commits to ensure rights safeguards for sharing knowledge, as well as calling on the states to include Indigenous peoples directly in their development of their NDCs. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the FWG as it was formed with equal participation by states and Indigenous peoples and direct participation and representation, the only place in the entire UN system where this kind of structure exists. Next slide. A key advance for us at COP26 was the inclusion of 28 Indigenous knowledge holders, 4 from each of the 7 Indigenous, what they call the biocultural regions, including, and we called upon, I was one of the co-leads, one of the 3 co-leads of this activity at COP26. For the first time ever, Indigenous knowledge holders were brought in specifically to engage. Next slide. These are some of the youth knowledge holders. At one of the roundtables, we did ask for each of the regions to select at least 1 woman and 1 youth from each of their regions to participate. And I'm happy to say North America had 2 Indigenous women and 2 Indigenous youth. I know that I need to be wrapping up right now, but I will just conclude by saying that Indigenous peoples have never just depended on the decisions of the states or the United Nations in order to safeguard our survival. So we have many methods that we have of our own that are ongoing. This is seed sharing, continuing to produce our traditional foods and medicines, saving our water and bringing back traditional irrigation methods. This is restoration of a traditional taro bed in Hawaii, where they've removed the eucalyptus that use a lot of water that are invasive, and also strengthening intergenerational knowledge sharing. And I'll stop with this slide. And I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that we can continue engaging. Chokwiltesia.
Great. Thank you so much to the presenters that just provided that great overview of the announcements and some of the key issue areas that came out of COP26. Much appreciated. Now we'll be moving on to the next segment of our webinar, which will focus on some of the negotiations outcomes that were discussed earlier and a bit more of a deep dive into each. So we'll have each of the presenters present, and just to note as well that you can include any questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box for us. So we'll start with Susanna, please, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Samira. So the first topic from the negotiations we would like to talk about is what is in many discussions the big elephant in the room, climate finance. So on climate finance, the discussions are becoming more complex and the picture is mixed. A couple of key topics here. Overall, the conversation on climate finance is changing. We're really seeing a paradigm shift here. While in past years, the negotiations were still mostly held by ministers of environment around financial requirements, we now see more and more ministers of finance addressing climate change more systematically throughout the economy. But the main change is that this time there was a substantial attendance of high-level representatives from the finance sector, CEOs of banks, etc., who actually committed to greening the business of their banks in terms of whom and for what they are lending money to. Regarding pledges, a number of substantive financial pledges have been made by developed countries as well as by global companies to address climate change mitigation, adaptation, aspects of forestry, and so on. While this is a step forward, at the same time, it is being criticized that these pledges have been made outside the official negotiation process where frameworks for monitoring and transparency are being agreed. So for pledges made outside of this, there is no framework to ensure follow through to these pledges. Now on long-term finance. That is another key topic of climate finance. The discussions continued on the efforts of developed countries to reach the goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year. As we know, this goal has still not been met. According to the OECD, the total climate finance provided to developing countries was in 2019 around $79 billion. The OECD estimates that the $100 billion goal may be met by 2023. Now, in terms of next steps, the discussion on climate finance saw a lot of discussion about disclosure standards for climate finance. Developed countries requested developing countries to disclose in detail how climate finance provided will be used nationally, which was met with some pushback by some developing countries. On the other hand, developing countries require more information, not only about how the $100 billion goal will be met, but also how it will be split among mitigation and adaptation, how the funding will be allocated among receiving countries, what kind of funding to be expected, like grants, loans, just for nature jobs, and so on, and also how to access this kind of funding. And finally, an important discussion point was the lack of a commonly agreed definition of what is climate finance. And the lack of this definition results in a fundamental differences in accounting for climate finance. Working on a common definition will be a major task going forward. With that, I'm handing over to my colleague, Kimberly Top, to summarize the results about the Paris Agreement Rulebook and Article 6.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Hello, everyone. So as already introduced, the finalization of the Paris Rulebook was a major outcome in Glasgow. So I will go through Article 6, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and common timeframes for NDC. This will, of course, be a rapid overview. We could spend an entire webinar on each of these topics. So it won't be exhaustive, but hopefully gives a good sense of each of these. So starting with Article 6, before going into the actual agreement, I would just like to quickly cover the nature of Article 6, the overall objective, and the three main components it contains. So Article 6 recognizes that some parties may choose to pursue voluntary cooperation as they implement their NDCs, to allow for higher ambition and to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. And the article enables such cooperation through both carbon markets-based approaches as well as non-market approaches. And we'll come back to these important aspects on higher ambition and environmental integrity, because some of the key issues in the negotiations really focus on how do we ensure both of these key aspects of this article. So there are two carbon markets focused elements of Article 6. So the first is Article 6.2, and this covers the more sort of decentralized approaches where two countries or perhaps groups of countries may come together to partner or cooperate on carbon market-based approaches. And these approaches may include the transfer or trading of what's called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. Then you have Article 6.4, which establishes a centralized mechanism within the framework of the UNFCCC and supervised by a supervisory body. And that centralized carbon crediting mechanism, in addition to being centralized versus a bit more decentralized, another key difference is that it enables direct participation of the private sector as long as those entities are authorized by the host countries. So those are the two market-based elements. And then Article 6 also has Article 6.8, which covers a framework for non-market-based approaches. So there were unresolved issues across all three of these areas, but there was agreement on all in Glasgow, agreeing to guidance for those Article 6.2 cooperative approaches, and then the rules, modalities, and procedures for the operation, the functioning of that Article 6.4 mechanism, and then finally agreement on a focus for a work program to move forward on the non-market-based approaches. Next slide, please. So there are a number of political and technical issues wrapped up in the Article 6 negotiations. So here I'll just cover a few of the sort of key political issues that had prevented resolution, finalization on these guidance and rules over the past years. So the first is overall mitigation of global emissions, a concept also known as OMGE. So this is with the a concept that intends to ensure that Article 6 leads to a net reduction in emissions. In other words, going beyond that offsetting term, right, where there's a purchase of emissions reductions achieved in one country and purchased by another country. But on net, the idea of Article 6 is to lead to a higher level of mitigation. And so in the negotiations, the issue was, well, what is the best approach, the optimal approach or tool or mechanism in order to achieve this? Parties debated this for some time, but eventually came to the tool known as cancellation of units. So this means that emissions reductions are achieved, and some of those are put aside essentially in an account, a cancellation account, so they are not circulating in the market. They are not going towards any one country's NDC. So in that way, they are representing additional mitigation beyond what is reflected in any one NDC. Now, this is it was agreed that this would be a requirement under 6.4 for a requirement of 2% of those units to be canceled, and it's strongly encouraged that the same occurs for those more decentralized cooperative approaches under 6.2. A second big issue was how to ensure adaptation finance. So this was along the lines of what we have under the Clean Development Mechanism, where proceeds go toward the adaptation fund. So the question was, well, how do we potentially set up something similar or the same in the context of the new mechanism and potentially the 6.2 approaches? So in the end, there is a requirement as well, similar to the CDM, where there will be a required portion of 5% under the Article 6.4 mechanism that will go specifically to the adaptation fund. And then under 6.2, it's also, again, strongly encouraged that parties adaptation finance, both through the adaptation fund, but acknowledging this can be through other sources and channels. Then we have another key issue, and this comes back to that concept of environmental integrity in the overarching objective. What is key here is to avoid double counting in the context of Article 6. And what this means is that a mitigation outcome, emissions reductions or removals that have been achieved, do not go towards, not count towards more than one country's NDC. And the tool for this is applying a corresponding adjustment, which is basically an accounting measure to make sure that things balance out on each side. You have an addition that's balanced by a subtraction on the other side of the transfer. And so it was known that this would be the tool that would be applied, but the specific rules in terms of when and how and to what the corresponding adjustments would be applied was an open question. And for the most part, yes, so the rules were agreed, though acknowledging there are some details of the approaches that were agreed that are still to be worked out over the coming year. Finally, another of these key sort of crunch issues was the relationship between the Kyoto Protocol mechanism and the new Article 6.4 mechanism, and specifically whether and how to treat Clean Development Mechanism units in the context of the new mechanism. So this was a big issue and contentious. We had different views, sort of, to fully allow in these CDM units, to restrict them so that there would be no carryover of these units. And what the resolution resulted in was a compromise approach where there is a limited amount coming in to the new mechanism. And so it's limited to CDM units from projects that were registered only from 2013 and beyond. So nothing before that, and only towards the first NDCs. I apologize for the background noise. And then there were also rules established for projects to transition in from CDM to Article 6.4. So again, that was just a rapid overview of some of the big overarching issues, but as you heard from our colleague Andrea as well, there were other really important issues in terms of Indigenous people's engagement, environmental social safeguards, grievance, and so on. Many more issues that we could have covered. So it was a big step forward. There's more work to be done, however, on some of the details over the coming year leading up to COP27. So next slide, please. Now we'll move on to the next core component of the Paris Rulebook. So that's the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or TF for short. So as part of the Paris Agreement, parties agreed to implement what is called the Enhanced Transparency Framework to report on national greenhouse gas inventories of emissions and sinks, carbon sinks, progress towards achieving the NDCs, and finally on support. So support provided to, needed, and received by developing countries. Those are the three sort of key reporting elements. And so what had already been agreed at COP24 in Katowice was the information to be reported in the biennial transparency reports, or the BTRs. So we knew the what was going to be reported, right? The greenhouse gas inventories, NDC progress, and support. In Glasgow, parties were agreeing on the how, the format, and sort of the rules and specifics around how that information is to be reported. So agreement was found on this, and parties agreed to common reporting tables and tabular formats, as well as outlines for the BTR, the national inventory documents, and the technical review reports by the technical experts looking at all of these. Right. So this was agreed. The key areas that were sort of the main issues to be resolved were how application of flexibility would be applied in the reporting and support to be provided. So on flexibility, this was key. So the decision recognizes that for those developing countries needing flexibility in light of their capacities, and when reporting on an aspect for which they have a capacity constraint, there is a flexibility. There's now an agreed flexibility provision and approach, which can be taken to allow for this. And then the other key element was just recognizing the urgency to move countries towards 2024 reporting. That's the year of the first of the BTRs. There will be a lot of need for support, right? Capacity building efforts to enable the use of these new reporting tables and formats and tools. So this was key for many countries to ensure there was very specific language in here that support will be prioritized and provided. So that is also there. We can move to the next slide. Yes, so the final of the three components of the Paris Rulebook agreed here is on common timeframes. So what are common timeframes? So in Paris, it was agreed that parties would consider common timeframes with their NDC. So the underlying premise here being that a lack of consistency with these time periods would pose a challenge, right, to track and aggregate targets and consider the status of implementation overall. So it was agreed that parties would consider this. It refers to just a step back, it refers to the length of the implementation period for a particular NDC. And there had been no agreement yet on consistency. So it was agreed at COP24 that all of the NDCs would adopt this common time frame from 2031 onwards, and that the length of that time frame would then still need to be resolved. So in Glasgow, it was resolved, the decision was adopted to update NDCs every 5 years with 10-year time frames. And therefore, parties are encouraged to communicate in 2025, an NDC with an end date of 2035, then in 2030, an NDC with an end date of 2040, and so on. So in other words, with that, that completes the Paris Rulebook elements, again, acknowledging that there is some further work to be done to work out details, and I'll pass it along to my colleague Samira now on loss and damage. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kim, and hi, everyone. So loss and damage refers to the adverse impacts of climate change that go beyond the limits of adaptation, right? So this includes the climate disasters that we're seeing more frequently every day, slow onset events such as sea level rise and coral bleaching, biodiversity loss, climate-induced displacement and migration, non-economic losses such as loss of traditions and culture, which Andrea had mentioned earlier. This was a key issue at COP26, as we heard previously. And also this has been an issue since the start of the convention itself. but it's received the most attention this year than it has at any other COP. And that's with many thanks to the developing countries, in particular, the most vulnerable countries such as islands, that really brought this issue to the fore, as well as a big push from civil society, from many groups as well. This issue is, it really comes down to this issue of fairness and justice at the COPs, looking at historical emitters, looking at the countries that have not contributed to the problem through their emissions, and yet are facing some of the greatest consequences today, not just in the future. This is separate from climate adaptation. This is looking specifically at those consequences countries and communities are facing now. One of the key areas around this is the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. This was established at COP25 in Madrid. And essentially, this is meant to catalyze technical assistance on loss and damage for developing country parties, to provide them with some of the capacity and the guidance that they need to address these consequences that they're facing. This is a demand-driven network. This is meant to provide developing countries with access to the expertise and the guidance from institutions such as Undp on the resources that are currently available on loss and damage. The functions for the Santiago Network were decided at COP26, and further operational decisions will be made in 2022. So there will be more discussions on the Santiago Network moving forward, but it's an important first step to make sure that the start of the operationalization of the Santiago Network started in COP26. But one of the most difficult areas of negotiations, which was also mentioned earlier, was of course on finance, and in particular finance on loss and damage, which I know is different than the finance that we see on adaptation or mitigation under the climate finance umbrella. While there is finance towards some disaster relief and humanitarian efforts, as I mentioned before, this includes slow onset events, this includes biodiversity loss, climate-induced displacement, other areas that are not typically within the climate finance umbrella. And many developing countries, vulnerable countries, really need that additional financial resources. There was a proposal put forth in the last few days of COP by islands and developing countries more broadly for a loss and damage finance facility. However, that was not agreed, since many of the richer countries were more concerned about liability and compensation. This has been an issue since loss and damage was included in the Paris Agreement, and there's a specific clause on this. Notably, however, Scotland put forth a £2 million commitment on loss and damage outside of the process. So we're seeing a lot of political momentum and pledges happening outside of the process on loss and damage and on finance. They did agree to establish a Glasgow dialogue, which will discuss funding arrangements for loss and damage moving forward. So this issue is not over yet. This was definitely something that will be discussed in the coming year. And it's a strong signal for what could be an outcome of COP27. So we're watching that quite closely. So that was a quick overview of what's happened on loss and damage at COP26. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Julie to speak about adaptation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So here are the few key issues that came up at the COP. There has been some progress on the global goal on adaptation, which is part of Article 7, whereby countries aim to enhance their adaptive capacities, strengthen their resilience, and reduce their vulnerability to climate change. Parties have agreed to a 3-year work program called the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, and they will work on defining further the qualitative and quantitative aspects of that goal, which would help both set targets as well as measure progress on adaptation. The second area of progress was on adaptation communications. This is also part of Article 7. And these are the documents through which countries would communicate both their progress, their needs, their priorities, their plans and actions. The guidance on adaptation communications came from previous COPs, but there was a call for countries to submit by COP27 next year, which would contribute to the global stocktake of 2023. For adaptation communications, the guidance encourages countries to do it in conjunction with other instruments that exist. It could be nationally determined contributions in the adaptation component, it could be the national adaptation plans, or it could be standalone adaptation communications. So those would be very important in the run-up to the next COP. On adaptation finance, as we all know, the goal of $100 billion per year is not met, and what is not met is also the 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation. However, there were some progress here with some important pledges made to the least developed countries, climate fund, the special climate fund as well, which both received in total $413 million pledges. The adaptation fund also had some pledges of above 300 million, which was really unprecedented and showed the importance of that fund, which is the first fund to allow direct access. And as our colleague Kim mentioned before, some of the proceeds of the common carbon markets, will also go to adaptation. Some of the pledges were made on locally led adaptation, where most of the adaptation is taking place, whereby above more than 450 million were committed to locally led adaptation. Fourth key aspect around adaptation is on national adaptation plans. There were no decisions as such, but there was a renewed call for developing countries to scale up their finance, to technology transfer, to capacity building, to the formulation and implementation of NAPs, as well as of adaptation communications. And that's really important for countries to plan for the medium and long term and to reduce their vulnerability in the long time frame. And finally, the least developed countries expert group, which is a key group under the UNFCCC, which has been providing guidance on adaptation planning, has had its mandate extended from 5 to 10 years. And they will, through this mandate, also expand their working groups and continue to provide that important guidance that help countries reduce their vulnerability and strengthen their resilience in the long term. With this, I conclude my part on adaptation and hand over to my colleague, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to just touch briefly on the global stocktake. And this is a process that will be running in parallel with the discussions on the global goal on adaptation that my colleague Julie just mentioned. And the word, I think, global is important because what this is a process to look at collective progress towards implementation of the Paris Agreement and goals. So how, as a whole, are parties moving forwards and successfully achieving the implementation of the Paris Agreement through the implementation of their nationally determined contributions or plans. And the purpose of this was built into the Paris Agreement to be able to also inform parties of ahead of their next sort of revision of their NDCs, their plans. And that is why there's a quite specific timeline from now leading up to 2023. And it's designed to be completed, the global stocktake process, 2 years before the next 5-year cycle of the NDCs begins, or submissions begin in 2025. And I think this is important because I think what has sort of slightly changed since when this process was envisaged is that at that time it was about sort of accounting. But now I think there is, as we've seen, not enough ambition globally. I think there's also going to be a sense of accountability around this process. And what we will potentially see is a sort of a growing momentum and potentially efforts by civil society, non-party stakeholders to use this global stocktake process as a way to encourage more ambition. And so it becomes not only about accounting, but also about accountability. And what we've sort of seen in our most recent NDC Outlook report on the state of climate ambition is there is clearly a group of countries, the G20, who need to raise ambition in order for us to bend the curve on GHG emissions. But also what we found was that there are a number of countries, essentially most of the developing countries do need support on their accounting so that they can be robustly reporting on the status of their reporting, which my colleague Kim was mentioning in terms of addressing and reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. The slide that is up shows a sort of a fairly detailed graphic, but it can really be broken down into 3 main things. These are sort of the information sources and the outcomes of this global stocktake. One of the big ones is that there's be a lot of information being collected and prepared and submitted. And this includes parties reporting through their national greenhouse gas inventories and their national communications, their reports on progress on GHG emissions, the state of GHG emissions, the adaptation efforts that they're taking, and the progress on NDCs. This will be largely being synthesized by the Climate Change Secretariat through sort of a collective process. But also UN and other international and regional organizations and relevant convention bodies are invited to submit reports as well to provide additional information. And then there's also the opportunity for non-party stakeholders and UNFCCC observer organizations to also make submissions to advance this process. So in addition to all of the information that is being submitted, and there is a portal for that, there is an opportunity also for technical assessments to take place during the convention process. And then all of these elements will be combined and considered at the end of 2023. And just to wrap up, I think one of the big questions is, what sort of benchmarks are needed to assess progress? And that's one of the things that will be tackled in the technical dialogues. Then what does success look like? This is the first global stock take, and what are we going to see out of this process? And with that, I will hand over to Verania to speak about gender.
Thank you, Rebecca. I hope you can hear me well. So good morning, afternoon. The gender decision adopted at COP26 is a stepping stone, as in June 2022, the Gender Action Plan agreed at COP25 will be reviewed by the parties to the convention. So the Gender Action Plan is our guiding path as part of the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender. The GAP has 5 priority areas, and you can see on the left side of the slide, because we're not going to have enough time to go into the details. So the decision included, amongst other items, the following. As part of the intermediate review of the Gender Action Plan, the decision includes an invitation to parties and observers to take stock of and map progress in advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in line with the priority areas of the GAP. Also, the decision explicitly encouraged countries to enhance the implementation of the Gender Action Plan, which is a signal that gender is not only important in the sense that it's also an agenda item, but it's being seen as relevant for the upgrade of the process. So, for example, on NDCs, the decision makes clear reference to implementation, recognizes parties' efforts in integrating gender considerations into their NDCs, and encourage them to make greater efforts in integrating gender into NDCs and national climate change policies, strategies, and action. As an example, 85 of the 89 NDCs submitted from climate promise countries have strengthened gender considerations in their revised NDCs. So this has been a really good improvement. However, gender was perhaps not as visible in certain areas, such as in finance discussions. So this area will require an additional push in the months ahead to ensure climate finance is inclusive and gender responsive. Now, on the role and responsibilities of the national gender focal points, which is another really important area, the decision calls to parties to provide support for the focal points in undertaking their activities. There are 94 countries that have appointed a focal point to date. And as you may know, the gender focal points could be a very important bridge between the international negotiations and the national development work in terms of gender and climate. Finally, with regards to gender composition, on the one hand, the decision takes note of the report on progress of constituted bodies in integrating gender considerations into the respective work streams and encourages to continue to strengthen their efforts in this area, But on the other hand, and based on the report on gender composition published ahead of COP26, the decision highlights the lack of consistent progress towards gender balance in government delegations and in all bodies. So for example, in 2021, the representation of women stood at 40% or more in 6 of the 16 constituted bodies, equivalent to that was reported in 2021. But on average, women occupied 33% of all constituted bodies positions in 2021, which was the same case in 2020. So this is an area that, you know, it requires attention, and still there's still work to do. So that's it from my side. Thank you, and back to you, Marty. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for this great overview on negotiations. We're now moving into the final block of presentations to talk about examples of UNDP climate initiatives. For this segment, we will have Cassie Flynn, Chibulu Luo, Program Manager on Energy, and Mehmet Erdogan, Communication Specialist. So Cassie, welcome back, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Martin. I am going to talk a little bit about UNDP's climate promise. Now, many of you have been involved in this, been partners for this, and as you can see, just from the host of presentations that we have had, UNDP's role in supporting countries to take bold action on climate change really encompasses the idea of how do we bring all of these big decisions out of the COP process to life? How do we help countries as they're thinking about things on Article 6, as they're thinking about adaptation, as they're thinking about technology and capacity building? How do we help countries to achieve impact on the ground? And this is very much where the climate promise lives. The climate promise was started in 2019 on the margins of the UN Climate Action Summit. This is the summit that the Secretary General hosted. It was before COVID, feels like a very long time ago now, but it was just a couple of years where we set out to help as many countries as we could. Initially, our goal was 100 countries to create ambitious, actionable, implementable NDCs. And now I'm very proud to say 2 years later that UNDP supports 120 developing countries with their NDCs. This represents over 80% of the developing countries in the world. We've supported many countries as they have submitted their NDCs for Glasgow, over 80% of them actually. And this really stems from, and you can see here the geographic diversity. We have 44 countries in Africa, we have 27 in Asia Pacific, 17 in Europe and Central Asia, 7 in Arab states, and 25 in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this really comes from an idea of partnerships. We have 35 partners, and you can see here some of the logos on the bottom. And the idea is that we can help as many countries as we can to be as ambitious as possible. And so now, as we're looking forward, it's about how do we turn these pledges into action? How do we start thinking about these pledges as essentially investment strategies to be able to deliver on some of these big pledges on energy, on adaptation, on forests and nature, and really help to drive the transformation that is necessary to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. You can check out, there's a link here at the bottom right-hand corner, climatepromise.undp.org. And we are very proud to be providing this support to countries, very proud to be sort of in it with countries in a very actionable, on the ground way with all of these partners. So thank you so very much. And please do check out that website for more information. And now I will hand it over to Lulu, who plays a very important role in all of this with the Sustainable Energy Hub. Lulu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. So yes, I am here to talk to you about UNDP's work on sustainable energy. We know that the energy used to support socioeconomic development is also the largest driver of climate change. And we already know from the data that 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions that are produced today are the result of energy sector activities. And so the reality is that we cannot have an effective conversation on climate change without considering the global energy challenge. And when we turn to the NDCs, for example, all country NDCs that we're seeing do have ambitious energy sector targets, primarily on the mitigation side, but also in promoting adaptation and resilience. And of the climate promise countries that have submitted NDCs to date, we're seeing that all of them include energy as a priority, and 95% of countries do have standalone detailed energy targets. And so switching to a low carbon renewable energy future is really at the heart of climate action and development. And so this is why I am very excited to talk about UNDP's new Sustainable Energy Hub and our ambitious commitment to bring clean and affordable energy to an additional 500 million people by 2025. We really aim to do this by building on our existing portfolio of clean energy projects across 100 developing countries, but also through enhancing new and strategic partnerships, both with stakeholders and the private sector on the ground. And so we really will focus on energy access and transition issues to ultimately enable a shift towards that net zero energy future, but also prioritizing integrated programming that supports socioeconomic advancements for the poorest and most vulnerable communities. Now, when I reflect on the COP and the actions and takeaways on the energy sector, we're seeing 4 key takeaways. The first is that we saw a statement that addresses the issues of coal phase out and fossil fuel subsidies. And this was a really exciting development. And even though the final reference was toned down, the wording does pave a way for the UN and other international agencies to really actively address coal phase out and fossil fuel subsidy. And this is something that we are actively doing at UNDP through our fossil fuel subsidy offer. And we're actually working with countries in thinking about ways to really support their reform efforts on the ground. We also saw a coalition of countries, regions, and cities agreeing to phase out coal and ending support to the construction of new coal power plants by 2030. And this is really sending a strong signal to all countries globally to follow. We also saw the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance being launched, again, really making it clear that fossil fuels are really not the energy source of the future. We saw countries like Costa Rica, Denmark, France, and others permanently and immediately ending the licensing of new oil and gas power plants, and really signaling that renewable technologies are the energy source of the future. We also saw committed financing for energy access, which shows that universal access to clean energy is really central to sustainable development and a just energy transition. And this is something that we're very committed to move forward at the Sustainable Energy Hub. So really, let me talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Hub and the key elements of our strategy. The first is that we're looking at SDG integration, which is really helping countries tackle their development challenges through integrated programming, with clean energy being the golden thread that brings everything together. And so really looking at things at a systems perspective as we address energy challenges. The second is really policy advisory, which is providing technical assistance to countries, including support to financial de-risking of renewable energy investments, for example, or innovative carbon finance mechanisms that can aggressively help countries realize their mitigation targets and encourage private sector participation. The third is on digital transformation and AI, which is really looking at using new digital tools and artificial intelligence to enhance energy planning, project preparation, investment mobilization, and results tracking. The third is on, the fourth actually is on leadership and advocacy, and really looking at helping countries develop technical insights on their energy sector development in line with the latest science and research that we're seeing. And finally, looking at new business models and financial mechanisms. And I'm very excited to say that we're working on an innovative financing facility that can help mobilize an additional $1 billion in investments towards energy access, focusing on the private sector. We're also working in leveraging additional carbon finance towards renewable energy projects in small island developing states. And so just to conclude, we certainly cannot do this alone. And we're looking to, at our partners and stakeholders to really help us in realizing this challenge and achieving our targets. And so we're calling on everyone to join forces and partner with us on this agenda. And so you can definitely reach out to me. My email is on this slide, and I look forward to continuing the conversation and discussing more with colleagues further. And so with that, I will turn now to Mehmet to talk about advocacy and call to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm happy to talk to you today a little bit about the advocacy initiative we ran this year in the run-up to COP26. So we really wanted to build momentum for COP26. We wanted to engage and activate citizens at large around the world towards climate issues. And we also wanted to create a platform where underrepresented voices could be heard and they could speak their demands to world leaders. And that's why as UNDP this year, we launched this campaign that you're seeing on your screen right now called Dear World Leaders. And this is a platform where we basically ask people around the world to answer two questions. One, how is climate change impacting you right now? Not in some future, but really already. How is it impacting you in your communities, in your daily life? And the second question we asked was, what do you want to tell world leaders at COP? And we asked people to give their answers by filming themselves on their laptops, on their phones, wherever they are, outside, indoors, and show us in their communities how they're being impacted. And the response was really overwhelming. We were really moved by and delighted by all the answers we got. We received more than 200 submissions from more than 70 countries and territories. You can see these videos on Dear World Leaders. You can navigate them through emotions such as anger, joy, hope. You can see them by region, and you can just really scroll through, and it's really incredible just to see the diversity of settings and responses where people were coming together and really demanding change and demanding climate action from world leaders. As I mentioned, we were really moved by the response we got to this initiative, this campaign. And so we want to renew this call to action this year in the run-up to COP27 as well. So please do be on the lookout for this, because we will renew this call to action, and we will have new surprises along the way when it comes to Dear World Leaders and how to kind of bring this to COP27 this year. So I believe that my colleagues will now drop a link in the chat to the trailer of the platform so that you can see what it looks like. I also encourage you to go to dearworldleaders.org, which I'm also putting in the chat now. And finally, we have a newsletter called Monthly Promise, where every month we send latest updates about our work, including Dear World Leaders. So I'm also going to be dropping the link now to the chat there. So please sign up to our newsletter to really hear more about what's coming up in the year ahead. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand over to Martin.
Thank you, Mehmet. Thank you all for trying to make this on time. Now let's get rapidly into the Q&A part of the session. I see 4 of the questions being answered. So let me start by the questions that are still open. So one is from Etienne and is directed to Andrea. So Etienne is asking, it's saying, you mentioned traditional knowledge of Indigenous people. I understand that LCIPP is a way to collect and convey such lessons. Is it the main way in international climate institutions to be enriched by this traditional knowledge and be shared as potential solutions for climate action? Can this be, in your view, further developed, and how? Great to see your focus on youth and women representation too. So Andrea, over to you to your reactions.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm off mute, but I don't think I'm on video. I will respond to the question, and thank you very much for the question. Of course, as I mentioned, the recognition of Indigenous peoples' knowledge, methods, and innovations was recognized in the Paris decision to implement the Paris Agreement. And it took us about 3 years of consultations between Indigenous peoples and state parties. We had 4 different consultations in Canada, 2 in Europe, or 1 in Europe, 1 in the Arctic, and 1 in South America, to decide how we would go about this. And a key element was the prerequisite for safeguards to be put in place, free, prior, informed consent, and other rights-based frameworks to protect Indigenous peoples for engagement in this process, because we have a lot of experience with what's called, you could call it extractive research of Indigenous people's knowledge. But we decided we needed to go ahead with it and engage because, as I mentioned, we have something to offer that we feel is essential, not just to address the threats to Indigenous people's ways of life that are already taking place regarding climate change, but also a new perspective for the states, which was carried out at COP26 when the state parties met with the knowledge holders to hear about a new approach that they really needed to take if the planet as a whole and the human species in particular is going to survive. So this is the main mechanism that exists for the input of Indigenous peoples. Of course, we also have an independent voice through the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, as it's called, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, that has its own independent voice as one of the 9 major groups as well. And there's a strong relationship between them. And we've never had an issue with gender representation. We would like to see more youth become involved in the process. But as I mentioned, what happened at COP26 was a big advance where we did have specific participation by recognized Indigenous youth knowledge holders as those that will be carrying on this practice and knowledge into the future. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that. I'm gonna continue with the next question from our colleague, Kitty Kun. So the question is, I'm wondering, since there are many types of finance here, which source of finance being discussed will be contributed to the ACE and youth mobilization participation? And I will hand over to Samira for this one.
Great, thank you, Martin. Yes, unfortunately, Elizabeth had to hop off, but I would have loved to hear her thoughts on this particular question. But I will note that for the ACE, as well as for youth participation, more funding and finance is always needed in this particular area. You know, as it comes to youth participation, education, this doesn't receive as much of the funds and the interest overall. Some of the funds secured from the Secretariat go towards the ACE initiative, but oftentimes it's the national budgets and direct budgets from countries and from governments that allow for this participation for youth and for information on the Action for Climate Empowerment agenda. But with that being said, there's always opportunities to build in more finance, and that's something that I know that they're discussing quite closely. But I don't have much more information past that. I don't know, Susanna, if you've heard anything on climate finance more specifically here, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for the question, and certainly an important one.
Thanks. Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I would say it's also basically some resources by the UNFCCC complemented by some national initiatives so far, I would say, yeah.
Thanks, Samira and Suzanne. We're approaching to the end of the session, and maybe we can go to this last question from Giselle. And I think this is for Lulu. The question on just energy transition is a very big one for every country, including those with very low greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you for the information on the Sustainable Energy Hub that is presenting a comprehensive offer to help countries to plan and implement this disruptive transformation for the economies and societies. The question is, how will this software will be operationalized? So Lulu, over to you.
Indeed. Thank you, Grisel. This is a very important question and something that we're trying to grapple with as we implement our offer. So I will say to you, at a very high level, we have a number of flagship initiatives that UNDP is leading to wave the flag in terms of this is how we can operationalize. The first is on Africa mini grids, so focusing on high deficit countries, so countries that have limited access to energy, but are also facing transition issues, and implementing a mini grid program that increases the financial viability of mini grids to support productive use of electricity in different countries. We're also working in the Sahel countries on clean cooking and transition issues as well. And then finally, we have a huge program looking at electrifying health facilities and schools through another program, particularly under what we call the Solar for Health initiative. But indeed, we are also working with our country offices to identify how the Energy Hub can be very flexible and quite responsive to emerging needs that come out of the countries. So I hope this answers your question at a very high level. Thank you.
Thank you, Lulu. And yeah, there is a comment, and if you can, our panelists can react and say a few words about the global methane pledge and ways for developing countries to reach the objective of this pledge. So I think I'm going to hand this over to Cassie and just ask you for your final reflections to close the session too. So Cassie, over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to everyone that has been a part of this webinar. We really, really appreciate this gathering of people, and even as I'm reading the chats and I'm reading the Q&As, I just so appreciate how engaged everyone is, and that one of the things that comes out in this, of course, is how complicated this issue is and how context-based climate action is. We see countries that are really trying to make bold moves on energy, bold moves on adaptation, bold moves in terms of some of these big pledges like the methane pledge. And this takes really all of us. It doesn't depend on just a few policymakers in a room or just a few people in various communities. It requires everyone to roll up their sleeves. And this means learning from each other. It means being inclusive in all of the voices and perspectives, in particular, local communities and Indigenous peoples who have so much knowledge to help guide us all, as well as some of these technical issues that need to be unpacked across a lot of these topics that you saw coming out of things like issues in the negotiations. So this is really just my plea to everyone to stay involved, to stay engaged. Please do reach out. There were a lot of people, a lot of experts as a part of this webinar. Please do reach out to them. Please do reach out to me. We are really wanting to really build and strengthen this community because this is really the issue that we need to address together. We need everyone at the table. So thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation, continuing this fight in the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to our audience for this engaging and interactive session. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as we have. As next steps, we invite you to visit the Sparkle site, where you will find the recording and the presentation, and also to explore the new Climate Promise website. I just entered the links in the chat box, and I will enter these links in the video description for our YouTube audience. And with this, I want to invite all our panelists to turn on your cameras and microphones to wish our audience a good day or evening and to end the session. And this formally ends the webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.